Um, so what I'd like to start out, if we could just put some context together. All three of our guests are working, and I guess Ricardo, you've put out a book most recently, right? Your book. So could you tell us a little bit about it?
So yes, it is my last book. It came out late mid-August, and the title is Canada in Decay: Mass Immigration, Diversity, and the Ethnocide of Euro-Canadians. And I'm not a specialist on Canadian history or even politics. Actually, I never even read Canadian newspapers, barely. But I felt it was really important to write this book because I am in Canada, and I was very concerned now, or have been concerned for a few years now, about the state of Western civilization. And being in Canada, I thought that it would be appropriate to write a book about what is going on in Canada. And so that is what prompted me to write this book. And another reason is that Canada is actually the one country that has elaborated the most the theory of multicultural diversity, more so than any other nation. And the main proponents of this idea, Charles Taylor and Wilkim Lika, and there are a few others, they have been constantly visiting Europe, Germany, telling them how wonderful it is to have this kind of diversity through mass immigration. So taking on their ideas to me was also important beyond Canada for that reason. And so yeah, so that is my
But
last book.
it's been, when did it come out? It was fairly recent, right?
Yes, it came. There was a hardcover version that came out early August, but it was pulled back because of a few editing issues. And I would say late August it came out, and it has been doing well. It
Yes.
is in the bestseller list in the politics and government section, up and down, but it's still there, and yeah, it's doing well.
So now, did you write this because it's just further continuation of your own sort of uh, journey, or did you put it together with the intent to try to influence the current debate?
Yes, no, I want to influence the debate because in Canada there is no debate at all on the question of mass immigration. You have a few conservatives complaining about um, the possibility that terroristic Muslims may get in, so they put a few safeguards. They try and stop people who come in and then get married to get citizenship. But all in all, the conservatives they were in power before Justin for about 10 years, and they actually and they proudly say so increased mass immigration to a level that had never been increased by any other party before. So that the conservatives supposedly are the counter argument against the liberals, but they want to outdo the liberals in the number of people that they bring in from other countries. So to me, it was really important to bring an alternative argument, which is not there. And I felt that as an academic, it had to be done in a scholarly way because, as you know, one of the establishment claims is that there are no scholarly arguments coming from our side, that we're just bigoted people, that
Mm.
ignorant and so on.
Did you when you did you realize when you put out um, your first book that it would have the influence it had? Did you expect it to?
Uniqueness. Um,
Yes.
no, not really. I wasn't sure because I had never written a book. That first book took me 10 years to write. And part of the reason is I was cleansing my brain from all this stuff I had learned. I had learned as a PhD student, and it was very difficult. Just really, I had to re-educate myself. I didn't not believe in anything I had been taught, and it was a fascinating experience to actually start reading other authors and thinkers and so on. And I didn't think it would have this impact, but it did. And one of the things that really made me glad was when I saw that Kevin McNaughton gave it a long review, and I was like, okay, people are paying attention to it, and then there were other reviews that came out, and so it became, and I think it has become now part of the
It's part of the canon now.
Yes, of our side, yeah.
Mm.
And some established world historians did recognize it. There is a review in the Journal of World History, and there are a few others, and they did acknowledge because there is a lot of research into it, so they couldn't deny that. But the main people that I took on in that book, they basically ignored it. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because it was really important to me to really demonstrate that the arguments are just flat out wrong. You take someone like Kenneth Pomeranz, Jack Goldstone, and A.G. Gunderfrank. They had written these books in the late 1990s into the year 2000, and really influential books. Supposedly, the books had overturned the old Eurocentric view that we associate with the rise of the West debate, and they argue that uh, Western civilization only became different and broke away from a similar pattern that you can find in the rest of the world. In the at most the the 1700s into the early decades of the 19th century. So imagine before that, you don't see that many differences between Europeans and the rest of the world. So I thought, I mean, it's just amazing that this kind of stuff is accepted in academia. These people, in the case of Kenneth Pomeranz, he was barely known. Suddenly he catapulted to the very, very top. He became the president of the American Historical Association and invitation months after months. And I just couldn't take that. And I really spent a lot of months, hours and hours, digging into their arguments. And they did package it well, and there were some interesting claims that they made. But all in all, it was just wrong, misreading of books. This is typical on the other side, is that they um, sometimes you wonder, do they do this willfully, misread ideas, books, they warp things out. And so to me, it was really important to counter that argument. And that's one of the things I did, among other things. Then I present my own view as to why I think the West is unique.
You, given, I'd like to touch on that issue, is do they do it intentionally? Now, excuse me, I have the same view of it, but I used to think they did it intentionally. I don't think that anymore. They, I think their frame of reference is just justification. They just do what they feel is right, and they justify it. And I think all of us, in fact, do that. It's just that some of us tend to, even though all of us justify, some of us are actually right and some of us are wrong. And I think that's the case. So do you still feel like these people do it on purpose, or do you think they're just doing it for attention, or is the frame of reference correct, or what?
Yes, there's no question that that is the prevailing view in academia. And as we know, one of the things that has allowed the left to, on the one hand, still play this idea that they're edgy, risk takers, and all this nonsense, and at the same time just present a view that has been established now for decades. Um, that this gives them that sense that I'm not really establishment, I'm taking risks here, I'm challenging other people, and yet they're all establishment and they're playing it safe and they want to go along with it because that's where the grants is, where the promotions are. So, so you can see these two things playing themselves out. But I do think that there's a point at which, because I was in the age world history debate, and I was there for quite a few years, and I debated these people. You can still Google it, although a lot of times they didn't put it on their mind name. They used to moderate a lot of the things I was saying, but um, I would just put out arguments, and they were not responding to them. And I do think there's a point at which they cannot face up to reality, to the evidence, and they will start using labels and avoid it.
That's right.
Yes, so there is a combination of both. This is where the establishment is. I'm still a risk taker, but I can't deal with those arguments, and I'm just going to ignore them. And after all, those are marginal figures.
So between willfulness, bias, and incentive, where do you sort of see them sitting in that spectrum?
I would say it's a combination of all of them. Yeah.
So, Kevin, you've just because I want to have you jump off on that topic there. So you've written a lot about this question of whether it's intentional or a conspiracy of common interest or whatever. And what's your view of that now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the points I made in Culture Critique was that I think these intellectuals did understand, in a sense, that it was consensus that was important. Truth was not anything more really than consensus, and so they were able to, for example, in the Frankfurt School, were able to tap into psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis had no empirical data on their side. They'd been going at this for decades. Now it's over 100 years, and they still haven't got any data on anything really. Certainly not the central core concepts like the Oedipal complex and all that. But yeah, that's what I think they felt. They felt that they could do this because when they plugged into psychoanalysis, you were plugging into people at major universities, at big presses, had a big presence in the media. And so it was in that sense, it was something that it worked. And I think, as Ricardo was saying, so often these ideas are so flimsy that they're not succeeding on the basis of their intellectual power. They're succeeding on the basis of being able to establish a consensus and having agreement among people and simply expelling people that don't agree. Psychoanalysis had a long history of that. And I think that's basically how the world works in that way.
It's pretty cultish, right? I mean, it's a very cultish behavior.
Yes,
right?
it's very cult. It acts very much like a cult. I mean, psychoanalysis is the paradigm there, where if you disagree with anything, they didn't say, "Well, show me your data." They said, "You're out of here." You know, I mean, it was simple as that. They ran it like the Communist Party, yeah, cult is a good word for it.
But their incentive is what? I mean, what's the incentive to produce?
Well, the incentive, there are a whole lot of incentives because, they became plugged into these high-level, prestigious university presses, the prestigious media, and of course they were promoting their ethnic interests. You talk about the Frankfurt School; it was a Jewish movement, and I think they very self-consciously felt that they were pursuing their ethnic interests. I mean, it's always a tough game. Again, in Frankfurt, the authoritarian personality, the big book that they published, is interesting because there is some data in there, and they did surveys and stuff like that. But then when they came to interpret it, it was this convoluted psychoanalytic nonsense. And it's hard for me to believe that they really felt that that was solid data, And of course, the upshot of that was any kind of white person who has any shred of ethnocentrism is a psychiatric disorder. Mm-hmm. That was the whole point of it. And so that was satisfying their ethnic interest in the wake of World War II. I mean, they fundamentally shift from being concerned about class warfare and class struggle with the standard Marxist thing to realizing it was really about race and ethnicity. And so they geared all their writing to that and sort of abandoned the traditional Marxist framework.
So isn't that? But there's a market demand for this information.
Okay.
Why is there a market demand for, let's call it a pseudoscience or a line of gossip or call it whatever you want to talk about, but something that's wishful thinking rather than discovery of those things which are sometimes uncomfortable to us.
Yeah, I think that all these things work in a top-down kind of way. I mean, when you have access to the big media, Hollywood movies and so on, psychoanalysis was huge in Hollywood and in movies. It becomes part of the culture. And again, it's not based on truth, but it's based on some kind of consensus that ultimately goes back to controlling it, to being able to get this stuff published. Harvard University Press, University of Chicago, being able to put people in those positions. Like psychoanalysis is nothing now. I mean, it's gone. But at the time, say up through the 1950s anyway, very important. But it succeeded because it managed to get into these major institutions. That's how
Let's say
things work in our society.
No, but I just things work in our society because somebody has found a way to fulfill a market demand,
Right.
and there's no resistance for it.
Okay, yeah.
And so why was there no resistance? I mean, there was a resistance by some people. Why did that resistance fail?
There was a resistance. I think it was always seen as by conservatives as really bad stuff. And because it really was about changing people's sexual mores, these were deeply embedded in Christianity, and so they was seen by a lot of conservatives that psychoanalysis was. But again, that didn't much matter if it controlled the most prestigious presses and so on. But the other thing was psychoanalysis developed a very sort of intuitively engaging metaphor for sex and life. I know when I was, in college,
It allowed people to feel like it created a discursive vehicle
Yeah.
for people to participate in something that had heretofore been unavailable to them.
Yeah, it seemed to explain everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through a time in college where it explains everything. I was a total convert. And then, it took me a long time to get over that, but I did. And, but it was a very appealing metaphor, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that civilization is all about repressing sexual energy. That seemed, I don't know, it just, because we were all aware, Victorians were very repressed and Christian sexual morality growing up in Catholic school. And just had the idea that you repress sex and you get.
I don't know. I went to a private Catholic boys' school. About all we did was think about sex in the girls in the girls' school. But anyway,
So it was in the 1950s.
yeah. So what I was trying to get to there is that there's why were conservatives unable, because this conservative reaction's been going on a long time.
It's a long time.
And so why have conservatives been unable to provide a counter argument to the left argument? Because part of the left's argument maybe is that some of what we've had in the past has been unnecessary. But why have conservatives failed?
Well, I think that they failed to be able to influence the high points of our culture. I mean, there were devastating critiques of psychoanalysis back around 1910.
Yes.
People were making the same complaints. It didn't matter because they had this consensus. They had people in the right places, and they were able to pull it off.
We're getting pretty close these days. Since the 1980s, we've made a tremendous progress in, and we're rewriting everything pretty much. Tom, I wanted to ask you the same thing: why is it we've been unable to resist the progress of the left? Why have we basically lost?
You are specifically referring to the conservative thought, right?
I don't want to put a label on it because I don't know what definitions people are real, but let's say conservatives, sure.
All right, well, let me stress just 2 points which I think are the most important. The first point, you have the legacy of the Second World War, where even the idea, the notion of conservatism was one way or another associated with National Socialism and Fascism, which subsequently over the last 70 years, and we can hear it even nowadays when we read the mainstream press, have been subjected to semantic distortions. Those words no longer have a specific political denomination. They have become the symbol of not evil, but the absolute evil. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Calling somebody fascist or calling somebody even nowadays conservative means that this guy is off the wall, that something doesn't really function in his mind. So this, we should not forget that this process has been going on over the last 70 years.
So you're saying there's the
This is the first point on the theoretical and ideological level.
Okay.
On a practical and political level, well, let's face it, the conservatives, be it the GOP in the United States of America, on the CDU in Germany, or for that matter CSU in Germany, or Cristiana Democrata in Italy, they haven't been doing nothing literally on the cultural level. They've been talking, they've been bragging, they've been boasting about the economic growth, but in terms of cultural hegemony, in terms of providing some counterbalance to the universities, to the media over the last 70 years, which have been largely controlled by the left-leaning of pseudo-Marxist
sure.
would-be Marxist intellectuals, even including this university, they haven't done nothing. They've been just thinking about money. I have to say that. Let's forget about the Trump's tower and so on, but I wish we have had not just towers in terms of structural buildings, but also towers in terms of resuscitating our conservative intellectual heritage now. We are talking really about big...
But what is our conservative intellectual heritage? Because I mean, what we can all look at. I mean, certainly, we're all scientists to some degree, right? You would classify yourself as a social scientist? You would classify, right? So, and why has there been no scientific argument from the conservative side?
Well, precisely for the reasons that I already stressed quite explicitly. The conservatives have been mostly concerned with individual well-being, with economic progress. I call it almost the new religion, economic progress. This was their religion, the new secular religion. Let's just make the country grow, be it in the United States, be it in the post-war Germany, be it in Italy and elsewhere in Europe. So the conservatives, the early, starting from Adenauer, even if you wish, Eisenhower, or even in Spain and France with Charles de Gaulle, they did not support enough. They did not invest much in providing the counterpower, in providing the intellectual counterpower, particularly in the areas of political decision making, which is the think tanks and of course colleges and universities. And this is even now this, and I must tell you that, and I guess I'm right in my projection.
Let me ask you, what is a conservative incentive?
Oh, well,
I mean, what's the incentive the conservatives have to offer to people? I mean, if we live in an era of pretty extraordinary wealth in human history. So what can conservatives offer to people?
Of course, they could have offered it. There is enough. Let's. I don't want to start dropping names. Let's start with Southern agrarians, for instance, in the South. There's a whole bunch of them, from the Tennessee universities in the 20s and 30s, who have produced, a massive amount of scholarship. So there is no reason to call those Southerners hicks. They were very intelligent people. And let alone in Germany and France. Well, by the by, I mean, I could speculate an hour about this. Consider the fact that 40,000 books and titles have been banned by the Allies in Germany after the Second World War. Not just in the field of genetics and anthropology. Of course, this is a somewhat tricky field, but also in the realm of literature. So most young folks, or even earlier, let alone now, they don't read anyway in the first place. People don't read very much. But they're not aware of those counter-arguments. I mean, in my book, again, Against Democracy and Equality, which has a somewhat polemical title, I'm mentioning just a few of them, like, let's say, Vilfredo Pareto in sociology. He's completely unknown here on this campus. He's talking about the circulation elites in a rather very pessimistic
Or at least teaching the argumentative difference between
so I guess
Pareto and...
This is what where the conservatives failed. They were not able to reformulate those ideas in a modern fashion. In fact, what they did, I know that specifically from Central and Eastern Europe, the conservatives only harped on the issue of Catholicism and Protestantism, and let's go to church, let's just pray God. So there was this general idea, which is still prevalent in Europe and of course in the United States of America, that all conservatives are Bible preachers, which is okay, and that they are just gospel preachers and they just regurgitate slogans that they picked up at the Sunday school. So I guess this is where the conservatives failed tremendously. I'm talking specifically about the GOP. And of course, we have seen some changes now over the last couple of years, but we can talk about this later on.
Okay, so I want to tie this back to, so you started, weren't you a Hegelian originally?
No, I wouldn't say Hegelian. I was a Marxist.
Excuse me, but you did, I remember
I know it sounds very
no,
weird.
wait. So I want to tie what you're saying together if I can. Do you consider where would you place Hegel in the spectrum?
Well, from the very early on, the Hegelians were split into the left and the right-wing Hegelians. So you can see that already, as soon as he died, there was a sense that you could take it in either direction. My sense is that Hegel himself was trying to go in between.
Yes.
Um, but the left Hegelian side won, and then because of the rise of Marxism, it really consolidated itself, and you did not hear much about the right wing Hegelian. So, in a sense, we know the Hegel as interpreted by Marx, or in a kind of leftist dialectical way. They really emphasized the dialectics of Hegel and took it to mean that everything is in a constant state of becoming and progression, and we leftists are the next step in the course of history. Whereas you can look at Hegel and realize that he has many conservative aspects to his thinking, in his
In the long
emphasis.
term, his
Yeah,
long-term thinking.
yes, and the emphasis that he plays on the community and the sense that an individual finds his sense of identity through participating in within a larger whole, and so on. Yeah.
So, the where does conservative thought go in the continental language, in the continental vernacular? Because when we say I'm trying to get to the point of, well, conservatives, in my opinion, failed to produce until really the past, until you put out culture, you put out your book. We've seen psychology come out with some great advances, mostly because of differences in the trying to abandon pseudoscience, recognizing that they're practicing pseudoscience, and then trying to actually move from observation projection to actual measurement. I mean, you've seen that trend try to happen, I don't know, it was certainly from importing information from cognitive sciences.
But I wouldn't say that the establishment has abandoned science in all respects. I mean, we know that we have chemistry departments, physics departments, and they have been very successful in that. So science is very prominent in our
Right. So, but
society.
why did we fail? If conservatives have a message that can be sold to the market, I mean, maybe it can't be, but can conservatives produce a message that can be sold to a market? If that message can be created, why wasn't it created?
Because in part, Sunik alluded to this, right after the Second World War, there really was an all-out effort to get rid of any notion of racial identity among Europeans. And so any research that was scientific in the area of race distinctions and also ethnic identity was disqualified and suppressed. Even one of the things I did in this book of My Faustian Man that came out a few months ago,
Which is wonderful, by the way.
yes, that I look into psychology textbooks. And psychology textbooks today, if you look at them, they endorse in a very strong way evolutionary psychology.
Correct.
As he said, psychoanalysis is out. But it's interesting that whenever they get to issues like ethnocentrism, they say, well, there's no science behind that. This is just a problem that whites have. And we're going to dedicate ourselves to curing our students from that prejudice. So there are certain topics that they just stop the science. It's just you just don't do it. You even see it in the author of the Blank Slate. His name just escapes me. Um, yeah, Pinker. I mean, he's very much into a scientific approach to human nature, but there are limits. He's gonna
He won't go beyond the limit.
yes,
He won't cross the border into controversy.
right. So I wouldn't say that the conservative side was not scientific. I would say that there were just certain walls set up, areas that you don't touch, and everything will be fine. And this is also connected to the issue of equality. The whole society was pushing in this direction. I mean, I was just walking here and I saw a student with the word equality just there, like, you, yeah. It's just, but if you want equality and the science is saying well, inequality. There is a substance to it in many different ways. That, as you may, I mean, Pareto is one of them as well. So that's the way I would see it, that our society set boundaries as to where science can go, and conservatives slowly gave in and accepted those boundaries, and then felt if we only push for economic growth, productivity, and efficiency,
Okay,
and
that's what I
lower
was trying to get
taxes,
at.
right?
So, but basically, what I was looking for is, my feeling was that, my understanding, because I was young, but I was active, is that there was hope. So just like the Enlightenment was a hopeful, I think of the Anglo model as the hopefulness of the aristocracy of everyone, and that was very hopeful. And so I thought that through the 80s, through the 90s, or at least through the 80s, conservatives seem to be pretty comfortable that there's at least some chance out here that once everybody gets enough,
Yeah.
enough stability, that'll be the end, and that we'll be right. It will ascend again. So I took it as a little breath holding at the time. So do you think that? Would you agree with that there was a hopeful, and would you agree or disagree, all of you, with that? This is what the question I want to get to with everybody is: have people changed from being hopeful to hopeless, or have they been changed from hopeful to hopeless to reactionary? I was wondering what you think. The three of you think about that.
So,
Sorry.
all right. So I still think that the Republicans and the conservatives are hopeful. They really do believe that the problem is with these liberals and the expansion of the government. And if only you just cut back on that, you can get individual energies to just get the nation going, and productivity and so on. And that open borders and mass immigration is part of that whole process of growth. And there is no question that when you look at this economically, they can still make strong arguments as to the benefits of mass immigration, if only because you bring cheap labor that lowers the cost, and it increases profits and increases businesses and so on. So they can still make that argument. The we're
It's why Canada can make the argument. I mean, if Ontario stopped immigration, Ontario's bankrupt.
Yes, there is a sense in which the whole economy is so tied in with that, that if it were to be reversed, there would be this.
Right, because there's no, we don't know where productivity has gone since 1970.
Yeah.
We should have a lot more of it. The only place we can't figure out where it's gone, it has to have gone to inflation.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then then if we're not increasing productivity, really, the only thing we can do to maintain the standard of living is immigration and selling off the land. I mean, that's basically the argument.
Yes, whereas the argument we are making is that economics in the long term is, and it's already showing it in many ways, it's not going to prove them correct. But we're also making cultural and political arguments and sociological arguments, and as to.
Can I say that differently? We have selectively, I think it's cherry picking, and economic data is cherry picked on growth.
Right.
And we don't account for social, genetic, cultural capital. We don't account for institutional capital.
Yeah.
We don't account for intellectual capital, for that matter. And so when we're measuring these things, we're measuring. You get what you measure, and we're measuring exactly what's leading us into this circumstance.
Like in Canada, just to end on this point, in Canada, this is one of the points I make in this last book, there is zero research on the downside of immigration. Everyone who's doing research is to prove that it is working.
That's right.
And if you don't do that, you're not getting a grant. So the whole system is geared to demonstrating its own success.
It's not falsification.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. So, do you remember the question?
Yes, I do. I would just, you asked me,
Please,
right?
go ahead.
I would just like to make a strict distinction between science, scientism, and the social sciences. There's a great deal of misunderstandings about this. Even our modern quote-unquote science is defined on the basis of dominant ideologies. This used to be the case in the Soviet Union. I'm sure you have heard of Lysenko. was a quote-unquote a scientist and specialist who actually hallucinated about growing orange trees in the Arctic. And this was a very serious type of argument at that time. The same type of a narrative was quite common in the communist Eastern Europe. And even nowadays, I guess I don't want to now go into epic lengths, we have empirical evidence as far as, let us say, some hereditary characters, hereditary traits among individuals, so let's say races or nations, are concerned. But this is a topic which is being carefully avoided. Just for your information, just a couple of months ago, the French Assembly, they they actually removed, they dismissed the idea race. It no longer exists. There are no races, there are just ethnic groups, whatever ethnic means. So we got to be very, very careful before we actually approach a topic. We got to study the etymology of the politically those buzzwords that our politicians quite often use. So I'm very, very skeptical about even political scientists. It sounds like a contradiction in terms. I myself, I can tell you privately, I feel more comfortable talking to geneticians, or medical doctors and biologists than all those political scientists.
Yes.
Now I could again mention now, I don't want to drop the names, of literally hundreds, well not hundreds, dozens of prominent German geneticians, were people of really astounding erudition and everything, who really disappeared from the radar screen and who disappeared from the curriculum. I'm not suggesting that the NYU should be focusing on race studies and hereditary features of different populations, but at least what I'm appealing is that give other side a chance to say what they think and how they actually back up their arguments. Consider, for instance, the 19th century. The 19th century, we had Saint-Simon, we had lots of quote-unquote scientists who also, in fact, just it occurred to me, in the 19th century, it was the left, it was not the right, who actually promoted the idea of colonialism in the name of enlightenment. The French Third Republic, by the end of the 18th century, they promoted the not invasion, but rather occupation of Algeria and the western part of Africa, Guyana, and so on, and here in Latin, or Indochina, because they thought, in the name of enlightenment, which was another religion, in the name of this enlightenment, we have to bring those peoples, those different races, to reason, and we will teach them. And now we have exactly, I got to tell you, because I'm very much obsessed with those words and name calling. The worst racists are liberals, because what they actually wish, or the liberals or Antifas, we'll call them whichever way you wish, they want actually to impose again, willy-nilly, this Western type of mindset on people coming from Latin America or from Asia or from Northern Africa and elsewhere. And this is also one form of, actually the worst form of ethnocentrism. I'm not saying those people are bad or good, but they're just different.
Let me pick up, because I have this thing. I get in trouble for this because I look at the man in the mirror. If you're failing, if we're being defeated, it's not, if the lions are eating you, it's not the lion's fault, it's a lion. I always look in the mirror and say, what are we doing wrong? And so that's why I'm more interested in is, have we given up? Have we gone from hopeful to hopeless to doing something about it or not? And what do you see? Now, I see a lot of movement in Europe, the European right, and it's been active for a while. But the European right is doing exactly what the American right did in the 50s and 60s, is producing the European equivalent of Kirk. It doesn't make any difference. People don't want, this is why I have a problem with German philosophy, all of it, is that it's basically an attempt to recreate Christianity and in secular prose. And I look at, well, how are we going to solve this problem as conservatives when we want this morally intuitive moral fiction as our solution, where we can convince other people. But it's science that defeats these arguments. It's not well-wishing, because those people that we're opposing don't agree with our emotions.
Those scientists are not allowed to have a
well,
limelight.
that's what I
They're
was
not
trying to
allowed.
get at, is
I
that
mean, as I mentioned a while ago, there are quite a few. I'm sure the gentlemen are here familiar with the name of some prominent sociobiologists. To some extent, well, one could say that we still have a First Amendment in the United States. You can still say a modicum of things which you are not even allowed to think about,
so
let
your
alone
position, your statement
utter.
is consistent.
Oh,
It's
yes.
just been the we've disincentivized
These
conservative
sentences,
thought.
the folks that they don't figure on a student curriculum,
So the
you know,
market isn't
Wilson and Murray and all.
Yeah.
I mean, Kevin knows about them. I know some of them personally.
Sure, sure.
Garrett Hardin, who was also my mentor at UC System, he disappeared from the map. He's not being studied as a mandatory literature in school curriculum. So there are literally dozens and dozens of names, especially in Germany, not just here, but of course
They've been wiped out.
and that they've been wiped out. Well, they haven't been banned, quote unquote, but they haven't been. They haven't figured.
So there's
Just look
so
at
the market for
the market
for this information
Yes.
has been artificially
Right.
suppressed.
The only thing is, of course, we have this alternative media now, the social networks and so on, where we can actually weasel in to some extent some of our prose, you know, which is very, very difficult because we don't have monies and different
Right, right.
stories. But that's again, yes.
Thank you. Kevin, you wrote something down. I wonder if you want to toss something in there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great points been made. But I think basically, I think that the reason conservatives have been dispirited is that anybody who gets off the reservation has severe consequences. Seeing that people like Phil Rushton, even Charles Murray can't give talks, you know, and so on. So they've been expelled in the same way that psychoanalysts that disagreed with dogma were expelled. So there are walls and there are severe penalties for academics. You won't get grants, you won't get promoted, you won't get tenure. If you do get tenure, people hate you. And so there are all kinds of incentives not to go there. And so what happens then is that the people who go to graduate school are ones who are already kind of on board. You know, why would you want to go to graduate school if you're a conservative? I mean, you're not going to fit in, and they're going to hassle you to death all the while you're there. And so it's in that sense it's artificial. And I think that there was. I mean, I remember before Trump started running, I was just really depressed. But what am I doing? You know, because it didn't seem to be going anywhere. And then you know he ran, and then the alt-right got a lot of publicity, and I do think that there's a lot of hope now, although you know Trump is not what we wanted exactly
Bought
by
us
any means.
time.
What?
He just bought us time.
Yeah, bought some time maybe, and he's raised some issues, and these things can't easily go back. I mean, there's this article, New York Times column today, I guess, by David Brooke about you know the populist right that what comes after Trump maybe you know make Trump seem relatively mild. Because this is not going to stop, because there are real interests here that have been papered over. Certainly the white working class, but I think white people in general are starting to figure it out. And what's so heartening is there's so many young white
Well, they
people
were
are
hopeful
figuring it
too.
out. What?
Well, I mean, this goes to the next series of questions I want to ask everybody. But white people were hopeful too, weren't they?
For Trump?
No, I mean just in general. The idea that everybody could, we call it the American dream, but the idea is the foundation of the Enlightenment, which is that we have the chance to move. So anyway,
I think America's main, especially liberals, I think were very confident, hopeful about the future. They had
But weren't
a sort of
conservatives
kumbaya image of what would happen.
but weren't conservatives also?
I don't know. It depends on what kind of conservatives. I mean, there's this tradition in American conservatism, which is very sort of libertarian and so on. And they couldn't have been happy with the vast expansion of government, the continuing restrictions, and now on free speech. I mean, I think the First Amendment's in serious trouble. One more Supreme Court, at most two, would be the end of it. And that would have happened under Hillary Clinton. So, you know, we're a very precarious state here, but I don't know.
So, Ricardo, could you talk about this? How did we just address this? Sorry. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because I've gone to the next series of questions. You brought up what? What is it you brought up there on your list? you brought up on your
I
list?
was just bringing up people like Phil Rushing who got expelled, and then I was talking about
Okay,
optimism,
I got optimism.
coming along with Trump, the publicity of the alt-right. And,
I got it.
you know,
So you've looked at academia and you've been a part of it. So what, and we've all agreed that there's suppression there. Is this lessening, strengthening? Where is it going?
Well, the left has reacted very strongly against the Trump phenomenon. So they have rearmed themselves, if you like, and they have noticed that for all their efforts at ideological control, that there are people out there that still don't buy their arguments. And there is now this idea that we haven't educated the children enough. So they're going to
Go down,
renew
double
their
down on
efforts
that.
in a really systematic way. But I mean, speaking of the issue of hope and the Enlightenment and so on, I don't think we should reject the Enlightenment altogether or the notion of progress. I think that's inbuilt into the way Europeans are. And it doesn't preclude the more negative side that Christianity has about the human ability to overcome their flaws. Because as you know, Christianity has always had this double side, a pessimistic St. Augustinian side, and then the more optimistic side that we can even bring heaven sort of down to earth to some degree. But these two sides are still with us, and they're part of the way Europeans are. The idea that there has been no progress, it just doesn't really square with the history of mathematics, the history of biology.
What do you mean there's been no progress?
That there hasn't been this, if you like, optimistic increase in our capacity to do mathematical analysis, to understand the nature of the universe. So that's there, and it's very intrinsic. I don't know what's that, but it is very intrinsic. It's like,
Can you go fix
okay,
that?
so it's gone now. So it's very intrinsic to the European mindset. But the conservatives are correct that human beings are very flawed creatures, and that even the very improvement that science brings itself sets the conditions for a decline.
Do you think? Do you think what you just went through is the kind of thought that the voting population thinks anymore? Because what you just described is a kind of piety that happened that I don't know, that was a natural course of Western education for forever, and I don't see it there anymore. I don't know. I mean, the kind of thought you just expressed, is it there? Is it there for people to have? I mean, what I'm getting to is, with the question I was trying to bring up is, can you sell people? Is it possible to provide an incentive for them? In other words, does conservatism have a message? We talk about racial interests and all, but most people, they act pretty pragmatically, don't they?
Well, no, the message of conservatism is still there, in the sense that you cannot have a functioning society without families, without people being married and behaving in ways that indicate that they are conservative in the way they go about raising their children, the way they try and stay married despite difficulties. We're going to see that this generation that you see walking around, they cannot sustain a civilization. They're completely lost and really have now reaching to the level of being pathological.
They've been raised as pets.
Yes, and that itself, you can connect that to the comforts that we have, that this generation doesn't understand the incredible struggle and survival instincts that are required to sustain a civilization, because they're coming with all these comforts, and they think it's just a matter of having the right attitude, of being open-minded and tolerant, and that's just going to keep the progress going. But it's just the other way around. We're already seeing the signs. You talk to students. You know, I have a as you know, you can walk into a classroom and the majority, at least in the humanities and even social sciences, are female. And I just tell them that statistically, most of you are not going to be married, and it's going to be too late for you to have children. And you are not going to be able to sustain a civilization with that kind of behavior, notwithstanding whatever progressive thought you may have.
Correct. Now, but again, is without any long-term institutions, without the family being the insurer of last resort, right? Without, in other words, without the family as the economic model, and the intergenerational family, just the way the intergenerational family gave way to the absolute nuclear family. What is there any incentive for people to not be suicidal?
I mean, as you know, some statistics came out and that whites have the highest suicide rates in the United States. It used to be the natives, but they have surpassed the natives.
Right.
Not yet in Canada, but in the United States that is the case.
I'm not asking this correctly. What is the conservative incentive? I think there isn't one. What is the conservative incentive under democracy to reproduce institutions of intergenerational transfer? And I don't think there is one.
No, in that respect, you're right. This generation finds that conservatism is too difficult a lifestyle.
Yes.
It doesn't afford
There
them.
we go.
Yes.
That's what I've been looking for. Is that we've had a couple of things where we've gone through a couple of generations now. We're trying this over and over again, and in the end, I just reduce it to incentives. And my major concern is that under this kind of democratic structure, with this demographic that we have today, it's actually there are no rational incentives to produce a conservative without separation. I mean, that's my argument. I don't know. I mean, I can't find any. So I'm just looking to say, well, it's one thing to say we should and we could, but people don't do should and could. They do incentives. And if you want to create incentives for families or for economies or whatever, you have to create those incentives, sometimes involuntarily. And so I'm just curious, can conservatives create incentives necessary to produce something produce the intergenerational families, sustainability, survivability? Can we do that? Do we have the incentives?
Somebody wants to try?
Well, certainly, and in traditional society, it was basically the Christian religion. People had expectations, and you get married, you have kids, and those are the things that have really disappeared. I mean, now people think marriage is a total option. Being heterosexual is an option, right? And so all those social supports have gone down the drain, and that's really affected, especially people without that much education. I mean, you look at the effects.
Sure.
If you look at marriage, for example, people that get married and stay married tend to be better educated.
Of course.
But
wasn't that always the case?
Well, it may have been, but the rates have gone way up. I mean,
I'm asking again.
rates for divorce and all
We
that
have
gone
this.
way up.
We have this thing in our heads, right? But I'm not sure history matches it. I mean, there was a reason you had a family in history, and it's really survival. There was a reason that we formed the nuclear family and the absolute nuclear family, and that's because of property. So if those institutions, those incentives don't, I mean, I guess the point I would like to get at is, can we, under this artifice we've created, produce rational incentives for people to choose survival? Because they're not. The rational incentives right now are to basically depopulate yourselves.
Well, we are heading for decline and collapse. That's inevitable.
So the question is everybody still, did you guys have hope?
No. Yeah.
Right. Some of you do,
I've got
right?
hope.
Well,
I've got hope.
right. But what do you have hope for?
Well, I do think we can turn it around. I think that we could establish. I mean, it's a matter of establishing norms about social norms about family formation and so on, which were embedded, as I say, in religion. It wasn't. I mean, property may have been the case in older times, Certainly wealthy people worried about that probably more than middle class, lower class people. But I think most of it was just a matter of expectation. And at a time when I was growing up, sex was not something you could easily get outside of marriage. It was just pretty much impossible. And so just a whole set of social norms that have just been destroyed. Recreating that is going to be, I don't know, I haven't even thought about how to do that because, as I say, they were very much embedded in a way of life and a religion that is
The way you do it is you recreate the scarcity that made it a necessity.
Yeah.
And you recreate this as scarcity that made it a necessity. The problem is we're playing these economic games, and this is creating an artificial plenty. So
Sex
that
is cheap now, very cheap.
You were going to say something?
Well, I guess we gotta dismiss this notion of conservatism because it's meaningless now. It's such a generic word. It means everything and nothing. Newt Gingrich is a conservative, so is Ted Cruz, but I got nothing with him, and I cannot relate in any possible way with him, So what exactly is conservatism? My definition of conservatism is certainly different from the one by Donald Trump,
Well,
despite
I
the
don't
fact
get-
that I agree on many points with him.
You can define
So
a
we
thing
got to
by
know
what
exactly what we mean by conservatism. I'm also a little bit hesitant
you
about
define it by what it's not.
Look, because again, this word has become thoroughly compromised nowadays by different people and by different sectors of society. So I might just as well, some of my opponents, some of my detractors call me a Nazi, a neo-Nazi, anti-Semite, fascist, monstrum, whatever. So eventually I might take a certain badge of honor of it, being called by those names, by smearing names. I frankly have no idea. I have a certain amount of respect, certainly, for Pat Buchanan, who I met once, twice, and whose books I've thoroughly read. So this is possibly, I should say, a type of a conservatism we might, I'm talking about the theoretical intellectual level, not on the economic level, that we might possibly resuscitate. But again, my brand of conservatism certainly differs from the brand of conservatism of some guy who lives in the barrio, who is of Hispanic origin and down in southern LA, They're also, or Tom Sowell, this black fellow, he's also a conservative, but I don't think I have much in common with him. As long as we reject saying openly, look guys, we are different in our family, let alone, we're also different within, amidst different races. So as long as we hush up, as long as we don't acknowledge this openly, that we are different, that we come from different background, we shall be just tossing those words around, having no meanings.
I agree with that. But on the other hand, I said, it's like, well, what's the recipe for a human being? It's what isn't human, because what's the recipe for a
I don't consider myself an abstract human being.
I mean, what's the
I have my
recipe for a conservative? It's something that you define by what you're not.
Again, let me just, it's a very important issue. This is, okay, you mentioned tabula rasa, blank slate. I mean, this whole issue that came from Enlightenment and which has been picked up by the liberals and the communists, human rights, this is such an abstract and I should say totalitarian expression, because in the name of human rights you can eliminate all those who don't fit into the category of humans, right? So this was used by the Second World War by the so-called allies and world improvers. It's a very sensitive topic. I don't like those generic expressions like democracy or human rights, because democracy and human rights have a different and specific meaning in Albania, if you wish, in the Balkans, and different meaning in Serbia. It has a different meaning for a Flemish guy in Belgium. It has a different meaning for a Moldavian guy near Romania. It has a different meaning for a Hungarian nationalist. It has a different meaning for a Romanian nationalist.
I live in
we
Ukraine.
gotta know
I
exactly,
understand.
Exactly, you know what I'm talking about. So we got to know exactly when we toss around those academic words like human rights, democracy, and all those lachrymose effusions that our politicians and many, unfortunately,
Well, I mean, there's
enjoy
there's
and indulge in.
convenient
We got to know exactly
speech, too,
the
colloquial
historical
speak.
context. We got to know exactly who we're talking about.
Yes.
And what is his drama? We got to know his gene pool as well. So what's wrong about studying someone's gene pool as well? So those are the issues we need precisely, and again, as I said, empirically verify. And And based on that, then we can start talking about human rights or abstract human rights. Again, it's a
Great.
long and heavy topic, but I'm glad that you raised this issue.
My work, which I have the luxury of knowing yours, and you don't have you don't have the luxury of knowing mine, and so it's specifically this problem, which is how to think of it as truthful speech. So you were going to you were looking like you wanted to add something a few minutes ago, and I want to make sure you can put it if you recall it. No.
No, if you have another topic to start, that's fine.
Okay.
We have 15 more minutes for this, and then we have Q&A.
Okay, so that means I've gotten to where, I've gotten the argument to where I want it to go. Now I have to get it to the conclusion in 15 minutes. Okay, so you said you're hopeful, right? You said you're
I'm
hopeful.
Well, yeah.
Are you hopeful?
I am hopeful, but there is no question that the West would have declined regardless of whether cultural Marxists took over. That itself is a symptom of the decline of the West.
Correct.
And so I'm not hopeful in the sense that I don't think that right now we are going to reverse that decline. We are very much right into it. And you can see the next generation embodies that decline to a degree that you have never witnessed before. So the decline is not going to be the same kind of decline that you had in the past, because science has been institutionalized and it just keeps going and providing additional research and increases in productivity. So that still is going on, and that gives the semblance that the decline is not happening. But decline ultimately is about the behaviors of human beings in their everyday lives. Simple behaviors as to when do you sleep, when do you get up, what relationships do you have, how long do they last, what do you study, and how do you relate to different ethnic groups.
Keep it back on. This was on before. No, I'm just wanting to give him. We're getting so close to this. I'm going to see if I can make it. I'm going to say that after the Second World War, we had active suppression of research. Now, and of conservative research. Now, if you look at the left's work in the social sciences, in other words, outside of the STEM categories, is it pseudoscience? Is it lying? Is it moral fiction?
There is always a degree of avoidance to scientific criteria, even in the worst theories, in the sense that they will collect facts to justify their claims. So, for example, a very prominent theoretical approach in world history came up from the guy Immanuel Wallerstein, and he has a whole school, and his argument essentially is that the West became different from other civilizations because it managed to create an international capitalist structure whereby they're constantly profiting from the rest of the world, and they maintain themselves at the top. So you can collect a lot of data showing that the trade agreements between the West and the rest are not even, are not fair. You can
But
collect
aren't you one of the proponents? I realize I get a little confused here, but aren't you one of the proponents that said one of the secrets to the West is that markets and everything?
Yes, but this is different. What I'm saying
Why is that different?
because the argument that Wallerstein is making is that the West rose to the top by creating an uneven international economy whereby you keep certain nations always at the bottom through all sorts of mechanisms.
Has any empire not done that?
I'm not denying that they haven't done that. What I'm saying is that you can collect a lot of data
Yes.
to show that the West does benefit from the
Yes.
kind of relationships it has with other nations, and that they may not benefit as much. You can collect data for that. So my point is that there is always some degree of scientific evidence favoring the establishment. I wouldn't say that all the sociologies you see around, all the economists, that they're
Selective
just,
accounting
yeah,
is
they're
very helpful.
bogus people just living off this fantasy ideas. No, they do have some science behind them, but it's very selective. They only
Again,
allow some,
let me try it another way. Moral fiction, most philosophy, pseudoscience, psychology, Marxist economics, Keynesian selective macroeconomics, which is it's not scientific the way it's done. It's pseudoscientific and it's cherry picking. So what's the distribution? I mean, or is it just? I mean, let me twist it, reverse it. If it was as hard to publish information products, in other words, publish information products, as it was to publish services and produce goods and services in the market. In other words, if you had to warranty your goods, what would the left be able to publish what they publish?
yeah, but I wouldn't say that the West should be all about science and that it disqualifies
I'm asking
philosophical.
let me try again, because I don't want to run out of time, and I think you know the answer to this question. So, again, the left produces a great deal of work, right? The right has tried to produce work, but it's been suppressed. Some work is still getting done. But in that work, it goes back to the original question. Do people do this because it's just cognitive bias? Do they do it because it's wishful thinking, in other words, moral fiction, like most philosophy? Or do they do it as pseudoscience, like Bose, Freud, Marx, and Cantor? I mean, is the left largely producing pseudoscience, or is the left producing, how much of what they do is actually scientific?
Quite a bit of it still is, as I just said, that you can make an argument even that there is still some discrimination against certain groups in our society.
Yes, yes.
You can find the data and the evidence. They would not have been successful if there was not some degree of science in what they're doing.
Great.
To me, it's more a question that they close off doors to alternative ways of thinking about it in regards to certain subjects, and that they don't have a full open line of inquiry. So it's not like they're pseudoscience.
It's
and-
more of a question of not full of limited accounting. In other
Yes,
words,
it's more that, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, in psychology, there is sort of a crisis, especially in social psychology. People are aware that 90-some% of social psychologists are Democrats, or they're very liberal, and they've had trouble replicating certain kinds of studies, the so-called implicit bias studies, which have been used which are certainly related to racial discrimination and all that sort of thing. And I think there's more of a self-consciousness. There's a guy named Jonathan Haidt who's
Fantastic.
a social psychologist, and he's been going around to social psychology conventions and saying, that the whole publication game is geared against conservative ideas. I mean, you have something that sort of fits with the zeitgeist. It's easy to get published. It's easier to get good peer reviews of it, and a lot of this stuff is not replicating. And he's saying that quite a bit is a sort of sins of omission, questions we're not asking, like, for example, race differences, biology of race differences. Those are the questions that just are not asked anymore. And you can't get
the
any grant
problem
money
with
for
that
them or anything
question.
else.
I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in here. Is everything I can see is that it's mostly a problem of distributions, not so much a difference in properties. So we've managed to eliminate the vast majority of our problem people over the past 4,000 years, and it's really hard to do that in either an African climate where you need to mature biologically really quickly in order to survive, or an Indian subcontinent where you can live out on the streets easily. So I don't know. I mean, I agree with that issue, but the problem is we take this, and I view this as a little bit of a pseudoscientific problem on our side, is that the primary differences between the races have to do with the degree of neoteny, right, and which produces very visible feature differences, and the distribution of the size of our classes. I mean, it seems to be largely the big difference there. No, I'm trying to see if you can refute that because I need a
No,
hold in that argument.
If you're talking about speed of development, that's Phil Rushton's basic idea,
Yeah.
and I think there's a lot of evidence for that. I mean, he talked about tooth development,
Yep.
how quickly motor development and everything. So I thought it was a very good theory, and but that's the kind of thing that is completely, you know, walled off.
Walled off. So we still have
students
this
don't hear
problem.
about it. The
So it's
public
not
doesn't
that. Sorry,
hear
I'm just trying to get to my clock. I got to get to Tom, and I got to ask my closing question. So what we've got is no. They're actually. They're actually making a genuine. It might be cognitive or ethical bias or a market, but the left is actually producing what they they're using the scientific method.
Well, I'm saying a lot of it has not been replicating in social psychology.
it's not.
That's a crisis.
It's
I mean,
junk.
some high percentage of psychology papers are not replicating.
it's
There's a
junk.
whole industry now of trying to replicate these studies, and they're finding
It's junk.
high percentage, like 40%. You know, I think if you get into cognitive science, something like that, it's probably pretty rigorous. I mean, there are
can't
areas
use
of psychology
reporting.
I think are pretty darn rigorous. Hard to get published, and you have to, really have several studies in the whole thing. But other areas, not so much. And there's political
Sorry, again, I'm
cast to it.
So again, it's not. Yes, there is pseudoscience,
Oh,
right?
there is,
right, right. It's not all pseudoscience, right? But our side's been suppressed, right? And I want to get to my understanding of the secret of Western civilization is once you produce martial truth in a militia, a voluntary militia, you end up with sovereignty, which in other words, property. You end up with rule of law, and when you end up with rule of law, you end up with markets. And as far as I can see, this fascination we have with truth has led to us having different languages, like different academic languages. It's having a market for competitive for ideas. We have markets between our classes. We've developed Anglo civilization is a judge of last resort in the monarchy, houses for the classes. So, me or them? Okay. So I want to know if truth is enough. In other words, do you? This is mostly starting with you, and I can work across. Do you agree? How influential do you think truth has been, and how have we? Why have we failed to produce? I don't know if I can ask this. Let's go with how influential has Western deflationary truth been?
Well, it is actually a very strong characteristic of European peoples that from very early on, you can go back to the ancient Greece, there was this preoccupation with the pursuit of truth, starting with the Ionian philosophers, and even through Plato and subsequently after that. So it really is a very unique characteristic of Western civilization that we have emphasized, as you put it, truth telling, that this is really important to us. And from that, eventually, there developed a very rigorous scientific methodology to achieve actual truthful statements. So this is true, but at the same time, we have to be aware that once you move into other realms of human life, like politics, just how human beings are in their everyday lives, this is not going to hold. This has been something that very few individuals really care about from early on.
Is that true? I mean, Kevin, you brought up this issue with in your books to some degree, and you seem to favor genetics, a genetic explanation.
For some things, yeah. For some things.
For some things. And I keep working with it, working on through this, and it's a really expensive commons, truth-telling. If you want to talk about a commons, marriage is not so expensive a commons to produce, right? Rule of law is a pretty expensive common to produce, or at least order is. Rule of law is a little more expensive, but isn't the reason nobody produces truth telling just because it's so expensive? I mean, who's going to fight the dominance hierarchy? I mean, who else on the planet can you go to a superior and say the truth, and it's not a greater violation than a greater, no matter how the benefit, it's you shouldn't do it.
Well, at the beginning, though, I think that one of the themes of cultural critique is consensus as a sort of substitute for truth. I mean, if you control the high points of society, publishing, media, and so on, you can sort of make a consensus. And certainly science has always been sort of about winnowing, and one of the passages of Ricardo's book that always struck me is that he'd say that somebody would come up with an idea and everybody would try and prove him wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was very individualistic, and science is fundamentally individualistic because you're gonna defect from anything that you don't think is true. That's what real science is. But now we don't even do that. You got departments of gender studies could care less about truth. They will give you reasons why we shouldn't care about
Correct.
truth anymore. It's all politics and identity politics at that.
What do you? I always find truth in post-Soviet countries a very interesting subject. My favorite question to ask people when I'm traveling around is, if I tell you a lie and you believe it, whose fault is it? In America, it's my fault, right? It's my fault for lying. But you go into Russia and it's the guy's fault for believing, right? So
Well, let me just backtrack a little bit for a minute. Well, I mentioned at the beginning this dominant ideas. Let me just for a second enter the mindset of quote-unquote left-leaning professors and pseudo-Marxist professors, let's say, on this college or probably in France and Germany and elsewhere. A rhetorical question. Does anybody ever read Marx or Freud now? Which retrospectively, this tells me that they never believed this in the first place. Now, this was a very trendy idea back in the 50s and 60s.
I don't know. I
So
think they
basically, I
believe
should
it.
say, well, what do we have now in curriculum? We have Holocaust studies, we have gender studies, we have LGBT.
Yeah, but that's
we have
postmodern. That's not
that's,
Marxism.
well, of course, but listen, I wonder. I mean, I'm trying to study. I'm sort of negatively empathizing with my with my detractors. I'm trying to find out what is crossing their mind. Well, of course, in the first place comes opportunism. I can tell you about that as a former diplomat in Croatia, when literally hundreds and thousands of former communists all of a sudden became nationalists. So I wondered in the first place, were they truly nationalists, or did they do it just because it was the particular moment ad hoc in Croatian history would just make it suitable, it make it marketable. So I should say the same thing, and I'm standing behind every words of mine, that even most professors here on this college don't probably believe in what they're writing or what they're scribbling, whatever, but they just have to follow the traffic. It's very trendy now to talk about, as I mentioned, the Holocaust studies. We can make good bucks on it, or to talk about gender studies, or talk about whatever the starving
surprised
black
how
African guy,
sincere
and
people are.
you know.
You're sincere, right? You're
Yeah, I'm trying
sincere?
to, yes, of course, I'm
It's
trying to be
very hard
sincere.
read. No, but
And,
you're,
but
you're sincere.
you notice that also in Eastern Europe, and you notice that everyone in Western Europe, most of those professors, most of them, whom I know some of them very well, let alone many diplomats who pat me on the shoulder in private, but then in public they will never say that aloud, that they agree with me.
That's different.
That's a different story. So I wonder, is there any character behind any of their statements, regardless whether those statements were well-founded or not? Kevin went through it. I went through it myself. So again, I would like to repeat this idea, the dominant ideas. Back in the 18th century, you know what the dominant ideas were. I mean, now we can look at the slavery. We are abhorred. We are shocked with that. But this was just call it a humanitarian Kipling type of an idea that you have to help the people from the lower strata. In the 18th century, what was that? In the 17th century, everybody believed in the Immaculate Conception of Virgin Mary. My grandmother did, in the French, she still does, and whatever. So nowadays we have different myths, we have different mythologies, and I guess this is something we gotta address a little bit. I'm particularly, not that I hate them, far from it, But I just don't like this fickleness of the quote-unquote academia, and especially those rulers and shakers at Harvard, at Yale, and major universities who just say one thing, and I truly wonder, do those guys really think in what they're saying? Or do they do it just because it's politically correct? You get grants, you get stewardship, you
I
get...
think that goods, services, and information are all products that are all sold to a market, and the market will buy a product that it can make use of, and I think that's it. And I
The
think
problem
only,
is we cannot market ourselves.
Well,
That's because we've been...
We're getting close to the half-hour mark, so if you wrap up, perhaps then we can also ask some questions.
The topic was circumventing the Frankfurt School, and rather than just speak in prevarications, I wanted to see if we could work our way up through to see what. It's not so much about how do you defeat them, but how can we. In other words, how can we talk about what they do wrong? It's talk about what we do wrong and need to do right. And so that's where I was trying to go. What I liked about this conversation was where we got to, which is that, honestly, I mean, I think Tom thinks there's some disingenuity there. What do you guys think the left intellectuals are disingenuous, or do you think they're fairly honest in what they're trying to do?
Should I talk again, or you want to? Yeah,
No,
I
please,
think
please.
maybe-
I want to answer this question because otherwise I can't close.
So what was the question?
Do you think the left is disingenuous, or do you think that they are totally genuine in their
It's a
pursuits?
combination of both.
Yes.
There are many of them that sincerely believe in what they're doing. They believe they're the ones that are scientific. The conservatives are creationists. I do think they believe
Believe in
that.
what they're saying.
But I also think that a lot of them can't cope with the facts coming from our side because those facts go against what they think is a humanitarian temperament with a sense of believing in inequality and so on.
Great, thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think that often it's phrased in moral terms, and
Yes.
that we can't violate these moral strictures. Any unegalitarian thing, restricting immigration is immoral. Not admitting refugees, everything is phrased in moral terms. But I do think there's a lot of deception that goes on. I mean, just thinking about the Frankfurt School and the authoritarian personality, the stories they made up about family interactions were just so bizarre. I don't believe anybody would believe it.
It's complete fabrication.
I mean, it just had to be, and so I think there's a lot of that, and especially when you go to the humanities and nobody cares if you have data, so you can just make up what you want, and I think some of these interpretations of Shakespeare and all that we see are just completely bizarre.
I just mentioned, just a brief sentence. They just, most of the academics, either this university or Nanterre or everywhere in Freiburg, they function within this zeitgeist, It's now popular, it's trendy to talk about humanism, about some lachrymose starving black Africans, about how to accept, different peoples from different parts of the world. And I guess when this goes away, like let's say 50 or 60, 70 years ago from now, they will probably start another tune. They'll probably start with another myth and mythology. So I'm pretty much pessimistic in this sense. I don't trust intellectuals, let alone Antifas. Well, by the way, and I look at the etymology of Antifa. Now, of course, the word communism has become so much discredited, so nobody likes to use it. Now they call themselves more Antifa. It sounds more romantic. Political romanticism. Thanks.
We already have the first question from the audience, which I'm going to read, and then we can give the microphone around for more questions. So, regarding the question of hopefulness for Western civilization, Leo Strauss has radically changed political science and its political bent. How do you understand Strauss's role in the culture wars?
Well, I have a chapter on Strauss. I have a chapter on Strauss in my last book. To me, the way he has changed it is that he in a very intelligent way, try to show that Western civilization is about values that we associate with openness, and he called them natural rights, but the rights of the individual, rule of law. And he argued that from way back to ancient Greece, Westerners were working in this direction, so that when you look at the West, in his view, it doesn't matter what kind of religion that society abides by. In fact, he wanted to push Christianity out of the West as being a significant identifier of the West. And he also wanted to push out any notion of race and strong cultural adherence, because there is a difference between just adherence to values that you think are universal, which is the case with Strauss. The values that he elevated as being uniquely Western, in the sense, are the ones that led to this concept of a propositional nation, which is that are values that any other people around the world can just quickly assimilate and they become Western. Whereas when you talk about culture, you don't even have to talk about race, but you talk about culture in a strong way. You're going to bring in Christianity as an essential component of the West. It doesn't mean that you preclude any other religion, or you preclude individuals deciding not to be Christians, but it does mean that you do believe Christianity is very strongly attached to the Western identity. So I think in the case of Strauss, that he did manage to kind of create this false view of the West that the conservatives, the neoconservatives in particular, have elevated as being the most important thing about the West. And it is that the West is about rule of law, the free press, equality under the law, and that just anybody in the world, they went to Iraq thinking the Iraqis will quickly accept these values. They are great. Everybody wants prosperity and so on. So I think he did damage to our own understanding of the West, and that he really was not a conservative.
I'd like to know any of your thoughts on the Identitarian movement, both in America and in Europe. I see that as one of the most successful examples of right-wing activism today, and I think they definitely had an impact on the German election this past Sunday.
I happen to be familiar with the Identitarians, particularly in Austria and neighboring Austria, and I had a privilege and honor to give a speech right in front of in the center of the city of Klagenfurt. They were protected by the police, and there were quite a few of people, Identitarians. So I do cherish their ideas. I think they're doing a very good work, not so much on the political level. That's very important, and I guess it's a good cover if we can say that, all right? So they're doing that more, how can I say it, by reversing this humanitarian obsession, by actually using the word humanity, but more in our favor, by actually pointing out how, in fact, this multicultural, putative, multiracial society in Central Europe now, because Austria is on the forefront, will certainly have adverse effects, not just for the Germans themselves, but also for the newcomers. So by and large, they're doing good work. As far as the French identitarians are concerned, they are much more involved with ancient culture, and this is something which is quite important. They just had a seminar in France this summer. They're dealing with ancient thinkers like Sophocles, like they did this summer, and they're in fact trying to revive our roots, not just our Christian roots, but our pre-Christian roots as well. So they do have a certain popularity, and by and large, they certainly had a certain impact, because mostly these are younger people, no skinheads, very, very good-looking people and so on. Yes, it's younger people who are aware of their roots and who are also aware that this onslaught of non-European masses is going to have adverse effects, the Balkanization effect, we can say, all over Central Europe. And I guess they're doing a good job. Of course, there's always some petty little, disputes a bit between them, and which is typical for all right-wingers and nationalists. But they're doing a good job, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. And if I can be of any assistance, I can possibly give you some emails of some guys who are more, or some girls as well, who are in charge of it, and who are. I think it's a good name also. It's a very neutralizing name, because unfortunately, again, I'm back at the linguistics. We got to find the the appropriate neutral name and don't give fodder to your enemies. Just don't use those icons and iconography and like swastikas and all this crap. This is a non-starter. Identity is a good word.
In America, the people on the left have been promoting identity politics for 50 years for non-whites, for different racial ethnic groups, for sexual groups, and so on. And there seems to be a sort of second thinking about it now among liberals, that they have created a monster because inevitably white people are going to start having an identitarian movement of their own. And they're terrified of that. And so some are saying we got to stop, but in a way, this is a train that's already left. It's so huge that I don't think they can unwind it.
The problem is now is that all peoples need, all middle class and working class people, they need an elite to carry them, or else they. I remember, I noticed, it was very clear to me that I'm an economist, and everybody else is not. So it was very clear to me today that I'm an economist and everybody else is not, because I just think about, well, what are the incentives? So I don't know, we can sideways on it, but yes. Okay, next question.
I've heard of the idea of the internet being compared to the invention of the printing press in terms of its impact on the access to information, which the printing press, of course, led to the Protestant Reformation and the Great Acts of Heresy.
Mass media led to the postmodern Reformation.
Right. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the impact of the internet on questioning the Frankfurt School and in its role in popularizing y'all's ideas.
It makes it very easy for it makes it very easy for everyone to find a clan. And I really like this for a couple of reasons. Because in mass media, whether it's from the pulpit or it's from the government radio stations or it's from a conglomeration of media with similar interests, or it's from the academy, which has similar interests. These tend to favor the I call it the feminine reproductive strategy, which is what is the word you use? They want to agree with each other. Consensus. And I'm sorry, I'm getting tired, so I'm going to forget my nouns. Whereas if you look at the male reproductive strategy, it's always looking for a hunting pack that's relatively small, that it maintains its leadership. That's why the alt-right is very class structured. So you find leadership groups at every social class, and so what I think is helpful for us is that it allows those social classes, those groups within those classes, to form discourses and for the leaderships to communicate with each other. So I think it's the first time in our history where we've had this available to us on an international scale. And so while our basic problem is that while the progressive side will give away their email addresses so they can be mobilized, it's extremely difficult to get the right to give away their email addresses so they can be mobilized. And until we figure out how to not only have the internet as a broadcast media, but also learn how to organize the way the left has, we're going to have the same problem. Is that an answer to your question?
Yes.
I think there's quite a bit of concern just now about the power of the internet. You see, PayPal cutting off all these websites. People are shutting down their like Daily Stormer and so on. And so they are concerned that there's too much information and that they can't control it. And that I do think if they ever thought that the alt-right was really a threat, I think you'd see a lot more of that. It'd be a total suppression.
Hi. Kurt, I see in a lot of your work that what you really are quite interested in is being able to empirically prove a truth of whatever that is, a truth. It just
is the completion of the scientific method,
Yeah.
because I believe that the Enlightenment was incomplete, and I think, I'm pretty positive, but it's a very technical argument, that I think I've solved that problem.
So it occurred to me when Professor Duchesne was talking, I'm from Canada, but in the 70s, when I was in middle school, is when multiculturalism became an official policy in Canada. And we were taught in school in grades 5, 6, and 7 that multiculturalism was superior to the American melting pot. We didn't want people to assimilate. We wanted them to live in their own communities and enrich us all by the interaction between these different communities. This was starting on an educational level of indoctrination.
Sure.
So that's now an absolute truth to many people of my generation and my age. And they're not interested in facts. It's become an absolute truth to them.
But
so
they
my
have a
question
choice.
is how do you build that bridge for somebody who thinks they have an unassailable absolute truth that's based not on
There are three ways of coercing people. Remuneration, in other words, you trade with them something, you give them something, you buy them off, however way you want to put it. You can force them to do things, rule of law, and you can provide them with opportunities, which is what intellectuals do, is we try to frame the world around. We try to discover new opportunities and reframe the world. Well, they reframed the world, but you can only reframe the world around an opportunity that exists, right? I mean, if you create one that doesn't exist, it will fail. So you have to actually seize a real opportunity. And so how do you do it? You cannot do it through democratic majority rule. It's not possible. It's not going to happen. That's why I was focusing this conversation on the honesty of the left. I was focusing it on the incentive, the failures of conservatives, because they have nothing to sell, and the fact that the only solution is actually that democracy democracy as we practice it, it's just a monopoly. It's like any other monopoly. So where do monopoly markets work? Well, they don't. What do they produce? Corruption. What happens when you have a monopoly market? Well, you can't use the market to negotiate, right? You have to circumvent the market. What is postmodernism? What did Marxism do? They seek to circumvent the market. So how do you restore the market? Well, I think that's really what we have to talk about doing, is we have to stop thinking, hopefully, that you're going to convince anybody that we have anything to sell. We don't have something to sell to others. We have something we want to save from consumption. And so you don't go and try to convince other people that there's an interest that we commonly share. We don't share that interest anymore. There's no more continent to exploit. Well, there is in Canada. That's why they're doing the immigration thing, because otherwise Canada's economy couldn't stay afloat. So the way you do is you basically increase. You don't try to sell the other people. You increase the cost of increase the cost of your tolerating them.
Thank you. Yes. Well, firstly, I would like to say I'm very glad that that this event is being
Thanks,
held.
man.
Yes,
I
Kurt.
can't believe these august gentlemen showed up for our beer and keg party.
It's been wonderful so far. Everything I've heard has been a pleasure and a privilege. I'm going to say one of the alternative definitions of checking is acknowledging, and I would like to very heartily check my privilege and acknowledge my great privilege to hear from all of you today.
I love you, brother.
Same to you, Kurt. And so I'd like to, if you'll, I beg your indulgence to ask a very basic question, if you might care to each answer, since the cornerstone, the fundamental basis of proprietarianism, as I understand it, is truth, and it's revealing, it's telling. What does truth mean to each of you individually, and what alternative styling of the same question, what value do you place on it?
I'm going to ask everybody a hard question. I'm going last.
If you don't mind, yeah, whatever you want to do with that question. Thank you.
Well, in my case, sometimes I ask why it was that I became so preoccupied with the West. And I think it was that I started realizing, still as a leftist, that the other side was making all kinds of claims for which there was not enough evidence. One key argument they were making, which I already mentioned, is that what made the West different is that they stumbled into the Americas, they found gold and silver, and so on and so forth. And as I look at the evidence, I realize that first they're ignoring why it was that the West in the first place went to the Americas, and it's a far more complicated argument. I mean, you just look at Columbus, and you cannot get away from the reality that he was one explorer among many, that he was in his day known to be an excellent navigator, that crossing the Atlantic, it is true the sea patterns and the wind patterns are not as bad as in some other areas, but it's not easy. People now understand that he chose more or less the best line across that ocean to get to the Americas, and that required a lot of know-how. And the moment he arrived and he discovered these new lands, the word spread out throughout Europe, and then it was one navigator after another from all areas of Europe doing the same, so that within 50 years, the Europeans had mapped the entire world, and this had not been done before. So when I look at that, I go, well, why are they only talking about the silver that was taken from the Americas and just keeping it at that level, the discussion? So my interest in the truth is that exploration, to properly understand it, requires a lot more thinking that we were being led to think about.
Well, when I got into all this, it was a purely theoretical question in sociobiology about group selection. The standard view was that there was no such thing as group selection. It was just didn't happen. And I come from a very, because I was on the left maybe, I was very into culture could be very important. And so I had the idea that humans could create groups that animals could not. And so I decided I wanted to study study a group that was well documented, and I studied Jews, and that was how I got into this. I didn't have any other, I didn't have any animosity or know a lot of Jews that I had problems with or something. In fact, I had just the opposite. So it was just that, and then it developed and then I'm starting to read, and then when I got to the 20th century, then I really started to get a commitment and started to really think that a lot of what these people are saying are really not in my interest. They're compromising my interests. A chapter on immigration, for example. So that's really how I came about this.
So what's truth to you, though?
What is truth to me is, having some kind of mapping function to reality. That's the old correspondence theory of truth in philosophy. I don't.
You read like I'm just complimenting you.
I know it's.
You read like a scientist. I mean, you write great work.
I started out in philosophy. I started out as a graduate student in philosophy, and I decided it wasn't the way to go, and it just was not going to be the wave of the future. But I really believe there is a correspondence theory of truth that we can get closer. Some theories are better than others, and some things are absolutely ridiculous.
I'll be very explicit. I don't think we even need to talk about what truth is or not. I'll tell you, I mentioned Vilfredo Pareto, but I can probably mention a few other authors like from Machiavelli or Gentile and so on. I don't want to now impress you with the names. I remember this quote by Vilfredo Pareto who said, "Whoever becomes a lamb will find a wolf to eat him." So there's a certain guilt feeling among whites now here in the United States who constantly need to make penitence and atonement for alleged or real killings of the Indians. And I remember, let me just backtrack, Vilfredo Pareto said at one point, if the Chinese had invented the Gatling gun, he wrote that in 1910, most likely they would have controlled the world. Now it turned out that the whites invented the Gatling gun, so that's the way it is. So folks, let's not make much jokes about this. What keeps America alive, it's not this pontification about the human rights and the first and second amendment. What keeps America alive are 7 fleet on 7 seas. That's the way it is. So again, I don't feel comfortable. Exactly. I don't like talking about truth or not truth. The truth depends on the eye of the observer. I grew up in communist Yugoslavia. I grew up also in capitalist America and in capitalist Europe. So I heard different versions of truth to the extent that I'm truly getting sick of truth. And I'd rather like to hear lies. And lies, I've had enough of it.
I actually would. It would be fun. Hopefully, I'll get a chance to talk to you another time about this whole truth and fiction thing, because the Russian thing for pseudoscience really, it's still, even though you go over and you hire programmers, which is an engineering job, and there's still this little bit of pseudoscience that I have a really hard time. It's just like this desire for magic to be there. I just don't understand it. I still don't understand it. Yes, yes, sorry. Um, uh, well, my thing. Anybody who's read me knows my position on truth is that it's the elimination of ignorance, error, bias, wishful thinking, suggestion, obscurantism, and deceit, and it's a systematic process which we can systematically use through the different grammars that are available to us. Now, I'm not going to get into the technology what that means. That's far too outside of this. But I'm going to flip it around and say, instead of saying what truth is, I'm going to say that my opinion is the reason the West is unique is that once you discover truth, sovereignty, rule of law, and markets, it's basically an OODA loop, and you can't adapt a people faster by any other means than that. And so the West is not often first, but we're always the fastest, and will always be the fastest as long as we can preserve this truth. My problem is it's an extremely expensive commons, and the combination of the Marxist and the Frankfurt School and the Marxists, which I'm going to separate out, the early Marxists, the Frankfurt School, and the postmodernists are actually conducting a war on truth. And that's actually what they're doing. They're undermining the core proposition of our civilization, which is your status or your self-image is not a currency that you have a right to if it interferes with the truth. In other words, what we accept is the truth, regardless of its impact on the dominance hierarchy. And this one principle is what separates us from every other. And I think the person who did the best at covering this, quite by accident, is actually Karen Armstrong in her first few chapters of the Great Transformation. If you read those.
We have 2 more questions.
All right. Well, thanks for all of you to be here. It's a great honor and privilege to be in the same room as these gentlemen here. Now, Sunich mentioned briefly that we live in new mythologies, which I found interesting. It kind of reminded me of the quote from Roland Barthes that went, the cultures of the past depended on epics and gods, while the cultures of today depend on commercials and comic book characters. But I think what's interestingly not delved upon very much, at least in terms of proprietarian ideas that have been expressed, were the ideas of Bertrand de Jouvenel in his books on sovereignty, as well as the sovereignty of law and the ethics of distribution, which I was surprised that wasn't delved into a bit in this talk, but most of you said interesting things nonetheless. But my question, which I would like an answer from all, if possible, is this. Since truth is truth regardless of impact, that necessarily at least means that in order for a quote-unquote right-wing world would have to at least establish new mythologies. For instance, in a postmodern world, for example, the Museum of Modern Art, which ironically museums are meant to commemorate the past that is no longer relevant but nonetheless significant, which is why I termed the Museum of Modern Art ironic, because even though it's modern, it's still a museum, which means in a way we kind of feel like that the modern world is no longer relevant anymore, which is why we call it postmodern. But there, well, no, I guess to be more specific, do you think the right should have more of a cultural movement in terms of artists and poets to sort of reestablish a sort of quote unquote the aesthetics of hierarchy. Like, for instance, the famous quote that goes, "The cultured man has a duty to be intolerant." For instance, in the early 20th century, people like Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, Robinson Jeffers. Well, do you think there should be a revival of right wing in terms of culture,
Yeah.
in art, poetry,
Okay, I'll be brief.
architecture?
I mean, I think that you're raising an important point, which is that human beings cannot live alone cannot live only through science, that we inherently need mythologies, stories that may not always be strictly accurate or naturalistic, but they still give us a sense of purpose and direction in life. We do this all the time with great historical figures. We emphasize that which is great about them, we mythologize them, and we want to keep it that way, either in the way we portray them in images, in pictures. So our side definitely has to have its own mythologies, storytelling. I myself do it when I write sometimes about Western civilization. I will slightly exaggerate some things, emphasize them, push them all along, minimize the other side. This is the way it works. And people want to see it that way, but at the same time, I always abide by the truth-telling side of it as well. In other words, once I just had an essay that came out in my blog on the history of mathematics, in which I argue that most mathematical ideas came out of Europeans. And there was a previous one that is connected to this. And I sort of did underplay the Islamic and the Chinese contribution. It was just part of a kind of, let's get excited, let's just push with this. And you don't have to be so naturalistic and scientific and flat all the time, because we do need mythologies. And this is just one simple example of it. Mythologies really go deep into the human psychology, and there's a lot more substance to it.
All right, guys, thank you.